Okay, so I'm very happy to announce our first speaker, who will kick off the speaker section, who is Jodi Rowley from Australia. Welcome here, and good afternoon, good evening, I have to say, because there it's almost 6. Is correct, Jodi?
That's correct.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we are very happy to hear about Jodi, who is based in Sydney in the Australian Scientific Museum, about this acoustic detection for frog. So we will see people power for frog conservation, okay? Thank you very much. And you can start, Jodi.
Okay, I'll just share my screen and hopefully that'll all work. Okay, so hopefully you can see now. So I will be talking about people power. I am a frog biologist, and I guess I somehow accidentally and very fortuitously ended up in the world of citizen science. And it was all a conversation between me and the director of the Australian Museum one day, where I was telling her that every species of frog has a different call. So they're essentially yelling out what species they are. And she said, oh, well, we should have a Shazam for frogs. So like the app that you can get that will tell you what song's playing on the radio. We are not quite there yet, and I'll explain more on that, but this is where this all began. And so I guess some of the reasoning behind things, I was primarily interested in understanding how our frogs were doing. Australia has, at the moment, around 243 species of native frog. We've already lost at least 4. There's many, many others threatened with extinction or missing in action, so that we haven't seen for a long time. And one of the biggest obstacles we face in frog conservation is that we just don't know that much about frogs. So we have very little information on where they are or how they're doing. And so I guess there's not that many frog biologists in Australia. And so we needed everybody's help that we could possibly get to better understand and conserve frogs, to gather that information that we needed to also not only monitor frogs, see how they're doing, see what we needed to do, but also as a proxy for environmental health. So monitoring the impacts of waterways, of how land use change, climate change, all these things, because frogs are quite sensitive indicators of environmental change. So this is kind of where that came from. And the frog with the little red head is a red-crowned toadlet, which is found only near Sydney, which is kind of unfortunate because that's where all the people are pretty much. So this guy is really impacted by people and is threatened with extinction. But of course, of relevance to this discussion, we have one introduced frog species in Australia, the cane toad Rhinella marina, and that is the sort of goat-like beast. So Australia doesn't actually have any native toads. Our fauna has not evolved with frogs that are kind of poisonous like cane toads are. So they are, of course, serious consequences across Australia. And so this is the one species that has been established in Australia that is from overseas that's been introduced. And so FrogID is obviously very relevant to this species. So FrogID is a national citizen science project. It's all based upon an app for your smartphone. So it's Android or iOS. It's a field guide, so you can have a look at all species. You can filter it by the frogs that are near you. You can look at photos, maps. You can look at breeding seasons, everything about the frogs. And as soon as a new species is described, it's instantly in the app. So it's a up-to-date field guide, which is really fantastic. And there were 2 new frog species described in Australia in the last year, which is it's pretty amazing how little we still know about our frogs. But the main point of FrogID is to record and submit the calls of frogs. And as I said, we're not yet a Shazam, and that I'll sort of, I guess, mention that later. And I've really enjoyed some of the discussions around machine learning here. But the recordings at present are identified by a team of experts. So there's about a dozen of us based at the Australian Museum that will listen to every single recording submitted. So all you do get out there, you hear a frog calling, you press record, 20 to 60 seconds, and the phone automatically adds all the metadata associated with it. So when I receive a recording to actually have to identify, so that's me with my earphones on my laptop like I am here, you get an audio submission that you can listen to, you can download, you can look at in sound analysis software if you want, but typically just the ears are good. You get the GPS coordinates and a measure of uncertainty, so how good the phone thinks it is at knowing where it is. So generally, if it's over about 3 kilometers, your phone has lost its mind and it doesn't actually know where it is at all. So it's pretty unreliable, but it's remarkable. This recording I made in a gorge where no frogs had ever been recorded for about 10 kilometers. No mobile reception, so no cellular reception at all. And your phones typically still know where they are, which is pretty amazing. And you can also submit photographs with the recording if you want. You can say what habitat and water body it's in, and you can add notes and you can guess the frog. But we'll listen to each one, identify the frog or not a frog. So quite a lot of our recordings that are submitted are insects, because insects sound a lot like frogs, occasionally birds, occasionally a kid practicing frog calls and things like that as well. So we'll let them know. Thank you very much. We learnt at the beginning of the project that we had to be very careful about at the beginning of the project, we didn't have feedback. So you can see the box for validators' comments. So usually we'll type something in there like, thank you very much, or this is a fantastic frog, or can you get a little closer? We couldn't hear it. But if people recorded an insect and we told them it was an insect, they would get very angry at us. And so we got a lot of emails saying that we were not a reputable institution and they know a frog from an insect. So we found it also really makes a difference. I mean, it's really nice to have that two-way feedback so they can comment and we can reply. And so we have that really great chat. They get to talk directly with an expert. But also we can really politely and add smiley faces when we say, I'm really sorry, that is an insect, but please keep trying. We really value your recording, and people do learn, which is one of the great things. So where are we at? So FrogID has been going for about 3.5 years. We've had more than 150,000 people in Australia, which I suppose Australia doesn't have as many people as Europe, so that's pretty good. Download the app, and we've had 22,800 people register and submit audio, which is pretty amazing. We've received over 235,000 submissions, so audio recordings, and you can see them mapped across Australia. Unsurprising for a citizen science project, that's essentially a population map of Australia. So all the people are kind of around the edges. And so we do get amazing remote recordings, but it is a bit of a population map. There is usually more than one frog species calling per recording. So we've got about 381,000 frog records of about 80% or more of our frog species, which is pretty remarkable. And in 3.5 years, this represents about 75% of all other frog records in Australia collected over the last 240 years. So it is pretty remarkable. You can see over time we've been getting an increasing number of submissions. The last year was absolutely amazing. I think it was a combination of increased reputation of the project, but also a very good rainy season. So we had a lot more rain than the previous year and a lot less bushfires, which was great. So FrogID is teaching us all sorts of things. It's teaching us that certain frog species are disappearing. It's collecting fantastic data on threatened species. It's looking at the impacts of climate change, in particular drought and fire. And there's a lot of good news on the impact of fire, which we didn't know before. So it's been the sort of best data that exists on Australian biodiversity after the bushfires about 1.5 years ago. We're looking at the impact of land use, including urbanisation. We're discovering new species. And of course, we're detecting invasive species. So for the cane toad, at the moment, we've got over 3,000 records of the cane toad across Australia, almost 4,000. And I guess one of the most important things that we're getting is that we're getting the leading edge of the invasion. So as the species comes down into New South Wales and across through Western Australia up the top, we're actually detecting in many cases the sort of most, I guess, outside the kind of established range of the cane toad. So in New South Wales, there is a small area which is the state that I'm in, it's a small area where the cane toad is known to be established. Every month we export all of the FrogID records, run them through those shape files and export to the local councils and the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries any records that are outside the range. So there's a kind of a reportable range. So FrogID reports every month on if there are cane toads outside of that reportable range, and some of them are just outside. We also immediately report anything that's far outside, and FrogID users have even been using FrogID to detect frogs that are picked up and moved by transport accidentally. So hitchhiking cane toads that end up outside of their range. So it's pretty fantastic. So the community's using it themselves. And we're keeping a very, very strong ear out for black spine toads, which in particular are one of the species that is often intercepted at ports in Australia, and we're very much hoping does not get established. One of the things that FrogID has, I guess, surprised me with is the number of native frog species that are establishing populations outside their native range. So these are just 3 examples of frogs where the white lines sort of demonstrate where their natural range, so maybe 20 years ago was, and FrogID is detecting populations of these frogs far outside, in some cases hundreds of kilometres outside their native range. And I guess this is perhaps not surprising, given that one of the common names of these frogs is the banana frog. Unfortunately, a lot of our native frogs have the habit of hitchhiking and getting onto produce like bananas and being transported outside their range. But we didn't realise before FrogID just how successful they were at establishing these populations outside their native range. And the biggest demonstration of that has actually been a tiny little tree frog called the dwarf tree frog, which is actually going crazy and establishing populations very far outside its native range, including throughout Melbourne and really expanding their range. And so one of the things about FrogID is that we're getting an understanding of how not only new populations being established. So as soon as we detect them in very strange places, we'll report to the state government in that state and let them know what's going on. Strangely, I guess no one really knows what to do with native species outside their native range. There's not as much, I guess, protocol in place for dealing with them, at least in Australia. But yeah, we're getting an understanding of how these established populations are growing and the interactions they're having with other frog species. Because we're getting these call recordings at breeding locations, which makes it particularly important in terms of frogs and establishing populations, we're actually getting all the species that they're breeding with, all the other calling frog species. And so in particular, this dwarf tree frog has actually now interacting with species that it never did in its native range, including threatened species. And this has real implications for conservation, as the dwarf tree frog often carries disease and seems to kind of be okay with it, but some of the frogs in its new range definitely are not. So there's a lot of implications there, and FrogID is helping us figure out what's going on. So we're really hoping that FrogID, and we do believe that FrogID is a fantastic tool to let local communities, empower communities to not only monitor their own environmental health, their waterway health, their native frogs, but also to detect any incursions of exotic or native species outside of their range. We are very much looking at next steps and improving the project with machine learning or artificial intelligence. We've done a little bit in this space, but yeah, I'm very keen for discussions. The recording quality is not always fantastic, but we now have the biggest database of frog calls in the world that we know of. So we have, about 300,000 audio recordings that are tagged with species. And so we're hoping now we have this huge database that we will be able to implement machine learning. And this will obviously increase potentially the speed of identifying things, potentially build it into the app, but also reduce the costs of the expert validation, which is not insubstantial. And in terms of that, we're also looking at public validation, so a system similar to iNaturalist, where potentially if 3 members of the public were able to listen to those calls, and if their identifications all matched, then it would, if it wasn't a threatened species, maybe wouldn't go through that expert validation. And that would also increase the ability of people that might not be able to get outside and record frog calls to be engaged in this project. And certainly it is a form of meditation for me, putting earphones on and listening to and identifying frog calls. And so I think it's fantastic for everyone else to get a chance. So this is the amazing project that I'm involved in. I thank you all so much for inviting me to be part of it and learn a little bit more about what's going on over there and with you guys. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Jodi. It's a fantastic talk. It's a shame my crayfish cannot produce any sound. It would be fantastic. Great to record them. Thanks a lot. No, really fascinating. I can see people really enjoyed your talk, and I can see the team started with the question even before you finish your talk. So thanks a lot. So we'll try to pick the question from the chat. So the first is from team. We have seen that you are receiving more records about the cane toads. So this can be due to the fact that better detection. You have better detection using sound as an additional recording methods, or because people are more involved and engaged in recording? So what do you think?
Well, cane toads are spreading. So part of it, I guess, is that we are detecting them before, I guess, other reports. Sometimes it takes a while for other reports to get onto sort of the databases and things like that, though. But I also think it is partly an artifact of increased awareness of FrogID and promotion of FrogID also within the government bodies. So when they're promoting, saying you need to report cane toads, they're offering FrogID as a way that you can do it, which I think is one of the amazing things about the expert validation, is that it is actually, FrogID is now actually being incorporated into government documents as a recommended tool to use, which is pretty amazing. So yeah, I think it's a bit of both.
Thank you, Jodi. A couple of questions from the chat, and then I will go to Quentin. So do you plan to expand abroad, making FrogID a worldwide app?
We hope so eventually. It's a lot to handle at the moment in Australia, and we're working on ways to improve it, but definitely expansion is on the cards because it really has revolutionised our understanding of frogs in Australia. It's a real game changer, and especially in responding to things like the devastating wildfires that we had, and it was combined with that, and then COVID. Scientists couldn't get out into the field, but there was tens of thousands of people across Australia that lived near these burnt areas that were actually recording the frogs, and we were the first paper scientific publication produced after the fires on biodiversity impacts, and that's just thanks to people out there with their phones.
Thank you. So you showed us that you have a lot of experts validating. So the validation is based, this is a question from the chat, that validation is depending mostly on human or also on partly on algorithms?
100% human. So it's listened to, by humans. The sort of stuff we've explored so far, we can get things like it's 80% likely to be this, but that's not good enough for us. And because there's multiple species often calling, like it might detect the one that's loud, but it won't detect the one in the distance. So I think there's going to be a balance of things as we go forward. Certainly we're prioritizing cane toad sort of machine learning, artificial intelligence, because that's something that we might need to be alerted to immediately. But for for now, it is people like me with these earphones on.
Wow. Good luck and good job. So Quentin, it's your time.
Yeah, so I started trying to type my question, but it got too complicated and my spelling's no good. So, so all of these sounds that are recorded are really important scientific data. And there are sounds being recorded by amateurs of bats, of whales, of birds, and things like this. And is there no global infrastructure where these can be stored and the real machine learning people can get access to build the models that are needed to separate these?
Good question. I think we're heading there. I think that's going to come, but I don't know of any central repository at present. You know, this is a huge issue for FrogID, but it's particularly an issue for people putting out these automated sound recorders. And I think that's something that we're getting a lot, is that people think technology, fine, they're going to put something out, and then they email me and say, oh, I've got like 3 million hours. Can you identify the frogs? I'm like, oh gosh, no. You know, it is. I think we're getting there. I don't know if sound is trickier than photos, or not as much has been invested in that space, but yeah, we definitely need resources put into that kind of machine learning.
I think it's any more tricky than
though.
images, but I have a meeting later today on images, so that's what I'm particularly thinking about it. But yeah, infrastructure.
I mean, they're not the best quality. That's one of the biggest. Some are, and we have like a button that we click on the validation side when it's a good quality call that you could use in bioacoustics. But you know, we've got up to 12 frog species calling at once, and honestly, I just think humans are better at this point in time for the vast majority of, if you want some more certainty. But yeah, I agree with you. It would be great to have some kind of central system.
Thank you, Jodi. The last two questions, one is from Michael. So do state governments provide support for the project?
The project is run out of the Australian Museum, so that actually is even though it's got the name Australian Museum, it's a state museum, so it's New South Wales government. But at present, although we did get some money from the federal government to start up, we don't have much money. So if anyone knows of any collaboration opportunities or any ways to support FrogID, let me know, because we want to keep this project going, because it is, I believe, but I also am biased, amazing.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I have a couple of curiosities. And the second one is there, and sometimes there can be problems in identifying the species or not?
I don't know if you broke up for everyone, but you broke up a little bit for me.
Sorry.
That's okay. The last question was, is there problems with identifying species?
I know that sometimes the recording can be different according to the different individuals of the same species. So if you can have any problems in this, and if you are sending the recordings of different species to other platforms or not.
No, so yeah, some frogs are awful, and they make more noises than I thought they did before this project started. Other frog species sound incredibly similar to each other. So we are doing field work to back this up as well, to try and see. So it can be really difficult. 3 or more people might listen to a recording sometimes when it's really tricky, and sometimes I will have to download and analyze it in sound analysis software. We don't send the audio to other platforms at present. There also is issues because people are often talking in recordings, and so it's sort of like a surveillance issue sometimes. But we do export the data. It goes to GBIF, the Atlas of Living Australia, and all of the state sort of wildlife databases on an annual basis. So we go also through an annual data cleaning process where we check for errors as much as possible, particularly all the threatened species, before sending out.
Thank you very much. Last question from team is, how many experts validating?
We've got about 12 people. So I used to spend probably, I don't know, 8 hours a week listening to frog calls, but I probably only do about 4 now on average. But honestly, it's lovely waking up on the weekend and having a chai and listening to frog calls, not even when I'm in the city. So yeah, we do have about 12 people. They have different expertise. So some will be one part of the country, that's their area of expertise, another person. So we kind of, depending on the rainfall across Australia, divide the workload amongst us.
Well, congrats again for your great work, I have to say.
Thank you so much. So
I cannot, thank you very much. I cannot see any other question in the chat. I cannot see any other raised hands. So thanks a lot, Jodi. It was a fantastic talk. I can see very enthusiastic comments in the chat. Thanks again.